Hello everyone, I'm Annie Gibbins and you're listening to Memoirs of Successful Women, the podcast where you get to hear candid conversations with fascinating women from around the globe who share aspects of their business and life journey, how they measure their success and what they have learnt along the way. So hello everybody, I am delighted to introduce today Ally Hensley, who is the founder and vice president of MRKH Australia. And most of you, I'm assuming, do not know what MRKH stands for, but you're going to find out today. It relates to a congenital condition that women are born with, 1 in 5,000 women actually. And we're going to hear all about Ally and why she's the founder of this association charity and what it means to the people who receive the services that she provides. So welcome to the program, Ally.
Thanks, Annie. Thank you so much. That was a really beautiful intro. And thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
You
Wonderful.
are so welcome. So tell us all about, first of all, what is MRKH, just so that we set the scene.
Sure. So MRKH actually stands for Mayer-Rokitansky-Kauster-Hauser syndrome, named after the 4 founding physicians, but it is also known within the community as malarianegenesis or Müllerian asplasia, which means basically absence of. You're right. Obviously, it's 1 in 5,000 females will be impacted by this condition, and it does occur in the first 6 to 8 weeks of gestation. So it's almost like there's a car going down the genetic path as we're being formed, and 6 to 8 weeks there'll be a kink in or a pothole in that path, which basically affects the reproduction development. So there's a formation of the ovaries here, and we have estrogen firing, which is why we typically externally form as a female, but internally the uterus and the cervix and the vaginal canal fails to form, or it's underdeveloped or malformed, if you like. So that pretty much obviously is the condition in a kind of a very quick nutshell. Most people with MRKH will be diagnosed around about 15, 16, 17 because there's an absence of their first period, because there's no uterus. There is ovulation, but there's no actual menstrual cycle, and that's called primary amenorrhea, which is really when a woman will present to a GP or a healthcare professional, and then a series of, sort of investigatory ways leads to the MRKH diagnosis. So it really does happen in a very vulnerable time already, when we're teenagers trying to figure out who we are and identity and what we'll be when we grow up as a parent or a partner. And it's really interjected with this traumatic diagnosis. Yeah.
Okay, so let's unpack that for the listeners who are just like, what on earth? So you're telling me that at the early stages of development in utero, something doesn't go quite right, doesn't form quite right, and it's to do with the female reproductive system. And you're saying that 1 in 5,000 girls at this stage are then missing parts of their female reproductive system, and they're unknown. They don't know this because anatomically they look normal. Like, so externally you have no idea. You then go about your life, and then all of a sudden your peers are having periods around age 12, 13, and you get to age 15 going, oh, hello, why have I not had a period? Everything else assumably is normal, as we develop. And so you're suddenly at a stage where, do you go to a doctor and say, what is not right? Why haven't I had a period? Is that the first moment that people would approach?
Typically, yes. It really does depend on where in the world you're actually sitting, because the healthcare systems obviously vary from country to country. I would suggest that in the UK, where I'm from and where I'm sitting right now, I usually live in Bondi, as you know, the NHS system in England is that you will typically go to a GP, like I did. And I was actually sort of sent away. I think a lot of practitioners may just say, just wait a bit longer. Maybe it's something to do with, it could be to do with over, athletes you hear about, excessive exercise can delay the period. There might be an eating disorder. There might just be something, or a late starter. I mean, there doesn't actually have to be a drastic reason.
Yeah.
But for me, in the NHS system, I then got referred on, and that typically happens with a lot of cases of MRKH. You'll see your GP, you hopefully will get sort of referred to a specialist, but unfortunately, that's not always the case, which can lead this diagnosis down that trauma path, which is why we exist, I guess. So yeah, that would be really how it's discovered, is the lack of a period. It can be more so now, I think, the way that medicine has changed. It can actually be discovered as a secondary diagnosis, where they were maybe getting an MRI or investigating something more primary, but then this is discovered as a byproduct, if you like, of that initial.
Okay. So they're doing an
Yeah.
ultrasound and then suddenly go, hello, you don't have a uterus. I can't see anything here. What's happening? Yes.
Well, yeah, that can occur. And I think it's really interesting, and this, we talk a lot with the medical community about the stages of the diagnosis and where that happens, and with what practitioner that might happen. I can't say this is statistically hugely massively correct, but most GPs will see maybe one case in their life. And I mean, there's a lot of conditions out there. There's a lot of knowledge to understand in women's health, and MRKH is one of many. So most, maybe those on the front line, if you like, to a diagnosis might not even know what MRKH is. They might discover it as a sonographer, if you like, going, okay, I don't know what this is. And then there might be looks of confusion, which the patient actually translates that look of confusion. And then they'll go through the process of maybe more specialist care.
Wow. Okay. So that moment that someone is given that diagnosis, and for those who are listening, Ally's obviously had that diagnosis, had that moment, as many, many women around the globe have had that moment of being told, okay, you actually won't be getting your period. You have a condition called MRKH, and it's named after all of this unusual name. And so what happens at that moment? How did you feel at that moment?
My experience, as the expert of my experience, it's really, it's like white noise. I just remember I can't really remember it, if I'm honest. I just remember a lot of white noise. And I went through probably 2 steps before I heard MRKH. So I went to a GP first, and I was given, when I did go back after my year of waiting if I was a late starter, and I actually did have an internal exam. So that was quite traumatic as a 16-year-old girl. And the look of expression on that GP was, something's not right, but we didn't know what. And then I went to a sonographer, and then there was something that was not quite right, but we didn't still know what that was. So it wasn't until I went in for a laparoscopy, which is sort of a surgical microscope going into your abdomen, was that when I found out about that diagnosis in a hospital bed. So there was about a year process in this of not quite understanding. My body just wasn't quite right. When I came out of the anesthesia, if you like, and I came to, there was a diagram that was sort of shown to me of what my reproductive system looked like. And I hadn't even fathomed that I was an infertile. And I don't really know what it meant that my vaginal canal was shortened. I thought I was just going to be fixed. And so the real gravity of the situation hadn't sunk in. And I think that was trauma. And potentially the early stages of a denial there. But that was sort of the millisecond, I guess, for the whole journey, because it got worse before it got better. I mean, I have to say, but most people will describe that situation as numb. They don't really hear, they're not really ingesting information. It's just kind of like that thunderbolt of trauma. It's a punch. And it takes various, times that we know to really allow that information to sink in. And that can vary between weeks, months, and in fact, years for people.
Yeah, exactly. And I know you can only speak for yourself on behalf of so many, and every young woman would have obviously their own experience. But I can only imagine how numbing it must be, because there's so many things to process in that moment. So one, for those who are unaware of the anatomy, that's right, you have this shortened vagina, so that from outside you wouldn't have noticed anything, but if you did an internal, there won't be much length there, if you like. Then you're also, so that's then automatically making you process, okay, to obviously be sexually active, there's going to have to be some kind of fix here, if you like. And what does that even mean? I have no idea. We can explore that. Obviously, then it's also, all that sense of normal and womanness, like, well, what is happening there? And then also, that's right, the whole concept of fertility suddenly unravels, and what does this mean for me? And that I will not be able to naturally carry a child. And so the whole experience, I'm thinking, compared to any diagnosis, it must just be, I'm not surprised you've called it as white noise, because it must just be like so much to process. Like, what are you actually saying? And it's such a shock to so many, unlike you, who at least have had a year in a way of, is something not right here? Other people just go straight in and have an ultrasound and then get sort of have a very quick journey in that process. So for you getting that diagnosis, what happened then? What was the unraveling? You've mentioned a couple of times the word trauma. What does that mean to you?
Well, I think in quick succession to the word trauma, I would say destruction. It is a complex diagnosis, and it's very, very, very layered, and it's big. It's almost too big for a teenager, or even, I think it's a family diagnosis. I should put that out there. I think anyone that is within that vicinity of that person will also feel the great impact and grief. But with MRKH, it's sort of two-pronged, and you mentioned that there's the anatomy of the shortened vaginal canal, which is indicative of, I guess, our plans to be a sexually active partner in what we would say is penetratively, just to sort of be a bit more distinct with that. But then there's also the component of infertility, and so you're trying to grapple with these two very, very big but two very distinct things. And I think they're the two things that we almost feel as rite of passage to womanhood: partnership and parenthood. And so to hear that that's being dented and that's being interrupted. And this is also a time, I think, when you're in your teens, where you're really trying to look at, your identity as a person generally anyway. You're forming your self-esteem, you're forming your values, your beliefs, your hopes, your expectations. And when that kind of comes at a rocket speed of interruption, then that rewires the brain against a positive path, potentially, for these values and visions and hopes, into a completely negative. And I rewired my brain into, after white noise came anger, frustration, confusion. And we know that these feelings rise from fear. And it was the absolute unknown and the absolute isolation, and feeling defected and feeling broken and half of and not enough and grimy. And this is intimate stuff, and this is now being put on to our parents and some friendship circles. All of a sudden there's this microscope looking over your most sensitive parts of yourself that you're not even really thinking about or that aware of. You're still learning, developing as an adult. So for me, I think I took all those feelings and did my best negatively to validate that. So if there was anything I could do to ensure that I was right, I wasn't worthy, I wasn't good enough, I was like a moth to a flame. And I developed such bad relationships around, food, a self-harmer for, a long time, terrible relationships, romantically. And then always having in the back of my mind that I was very much just a passenger in life, and I wasn't really participating because I felt different. So I didn't know how to have conversations with my peers about periods and contraception. I know I lied a lot, and I went home and kind of studied the names of so I could have some sort of input. And I tried my bestest to put a face on and a mask on. And from the outside, I probably looked quite a confident, gregarious person, but I was absolutely broken inside. I was grief-stricken, and I didn't know how to articulate that. So I just did all the bad things as my means of communication, and probably cries for help. But yes, and that was a big 15 years, I have to say, of that behavior. And I was back to I was just
it's not surprising it's 15 years, because it's a lot to unpack. And that's it, when you're learning of this diagnosis at such a vulnerable age, and it just throws you for a six. I imagine people respond in a variety of different ways, from not wanting, thinking, oh, well, maybe, do I want to prove myself normal and prove myself, sexually active and lovable and able in these areas. And with that, I know becomes a lot of very, very painful and stressful treatment. And then there's other people will approach it and go, okay, well, is this a sign? Am I gay? Should I just avoid sex altogether and not have this issue? But then that, maybe that is or isn't me anyway. So there's so many things that are forming in your mindset in those late teens, early 20s to 30s. It's not surprising at all that people will respond in the only way that they can, which is going to be different for every person. And I thank you so much for your honesty in sharing that. So when you actually got, what stage did you get to and you suddenly went, enough, I need to, who am I? What does this all mean for me? When you had finished that 15-year journey, what happened?
I think it's a series. Of sort of, I call them my turnaround moments. Sort of putting context on this next part, with people with MRKH, because of the shortening of the vaginal canal, there is treatment that's available for people with MRKH, and that could be surgical or non-surgical to create that. And I went into hospital for 3 days to do the dilatory therapy program at a really great hospital in London called the Queen Charlotte's in Chelsea. And I was taught how to make a vagina, basically out of Pyrex molds. And that process was sort of, it started in hospital and then it went on for 9 months when I got my finished product, if you like. But I remember a few years back, I actually had the privilege of meeting a psychologist that was also present at the hospital at the time when I was there, when I was 17. And she said to me, Ally, if there is a period of your life that I would really love to work on, it's that time in hospital. And I thought that was really interesting, because I thought that such a short time was the catalyst for so much. And she was absolutely spot on. I now have kind of found the words to articulate that process. And for me, it felt like self-inflicted harm with my own consent. I was hurting myself. I was giving consent to do that, but it felt abusive to me. It felt painful, and it felt dirty, and it felt shameful. And so all those feelings sort of cascaded in silence for such a long time that I got to a point, about eight years ago or so. And I just remember thinking, I am so exhausted with hating myself. This is absolutely such a tiring, destructive existence. And one of those turnaround moments was my mum suffered a stroke at that time, and she recovered really, really well. But she is kind of my hero, I think, and my best friend. And I remember thinking, if she has the courage to heal herself and to recover and really try hard to overcome that adversity, then it would be such an injustice if I didn't attempt to do the same. I was living in Bondi, and I still am when I'm not in a UK sort of lockdown. And it's a wonderful hub of yoga and spirituality. And I found myself on the yoga mat like a lot of people do. And I just remember thinking it was the safe place to really get to know Ally again, where you can't run off a yoga mat and you're being really confronted with your feelings. And so for me, it had nothing to do with the fancy poses. It was really my own little love affair with myself. And also I was looking for help, and I thought, I really need to get a relationship going with MRKH. I really need to start understanding what role it's played in my life. And I talk about this a lot in advocacy about, having a conversation with your diagnosis. What does it look like, sound like? What's the impact like? What is its identity with you? And I reached out to the Royal Hospital for Women in Sydney, and I asked if a support group existed, knowing that two other countries in the world were successfully running peer support groups. And I wanted to go to one myself, and I got a really great email back from the CEO, who copied a doctor in Dr. Rebecca Deans and Jennifer Morrissey. And they said, we don't have a peer support group, but we really want to get one up and running. And you seemingly have the skills and the confidence, unbeknownst to me at that time, that this is something that we could do. And it was kind of in creating this peer support group and coordinating the first event, in turn, it was healing myself. I always think that's a really important thing. I think acts of service actually can, do an awful lot back for yourself.
So much.
Yeah. And that's really and my, really sort of unhealthy relationship ended, and there was just these little things, and it was kind of like this wonderful engineering I always call it, when I went into sort of a recovery phase of my life. And so it's a very, very distinct part of chapter that start back in 8 years ago now.
So 8 years ago, you did this big moment of, okay, enough. I'm going to learn about myself, and I'm also going to then put myself out there and say, because that's pretty bold. It's pretty bold to then be the face of, this condition, if you like, as well as learning about yourself, and then offering to say, okay, well, if there's no group, I'll start it up. And as you said, that's an opportunity to then give back and to be that support that, others have never had, so for the new women coming through and getting that diagnosis and having no one, it now gives them a community. And that community, when you started, that was Sisters for Love. It was called Sisters for Love. And it operated for then the following 8 years. And Jennifer Morrissey over at the Royal Women's is an amazing nurse and has been incredibly supportive in that time, as has the hospital. So then you, throughout that journey, you've also been working and living your life and, paying the bills and doing all those sorts of things. And then suddenly you went, what was the shift to turn Sisters for Love into MRKH Australia? How did you sort of make that happen?
So much of the early stages of the Sisters for Love really was about raising awareness of these 4 letters. That was the goal. Originally, I'd love to have brought, a charity status on much, much earlier, but I realized that we can't raise funds and donations if we don't even know, bless you, if we can't sort of advocate for what these 4 letters mean. We don't know what specialists are working in Australia with MRKH. We don't know where our community's sitting. We don't know what the reaction will be of the medical community or even, your average Joe, really. We just really wanted to talk about what MRKH is. And so in those initial years was really just putting it out there and out there and out there, and start repeating the diagnosis honestly, factually, openly, and I like to think of myself as good with people. So I think a lot of my time was really nurturing relationships with hospitals and doctors and people, and that takes time and trust. You know, doctors are very, very busy people, and so if you get this email from Ally Hensley talking about, you know, oh, peer support group and this is what we're doing, it's lovely, but
Yeah.
it might not necessarily be that massive priority. So what we were trying to do was create some understanding that peer support was actually a massive part of the
Yeah.
diagnosis and treatment journey. You know, empathy, connection, sharing stories, understanding, you know, like-minded people, not being alone and isolated. It took massive amount of time. And the lovely Jackie Quinlan and I loved kind of doing all that, raising awareness and lovely little videos and really connecting with our community and doing events, and we did so much. But really, like any organization, we were kind of at our capacity as two people. We were maintaining what we were doing, but we weren't growing it. And really to reach everyone in Australia that hopes to have support. We're not saying everyone with MRKH needs us, and if they don't, that's almost a good thing in that way. But those who do need us, we need to ramp it up a bit.
Yeah.
I've known Christy Sinkowski for 3-4 years now, I think, and we met in a peer support group in Sydney. And Christy and I got talking after that meeting, and I realized that we were both very similar also in that way that Jackie and I were, of really wanting to dismantle and break down the diagnosis so we could really start advocating on kind of a bigger scale. She is an incredible technical minded person. She works wonderful on health policy. She's incredibly organized, methodical, all these wonderful skills. You know, I'm kind of like a creative and I'm like big picture, things. Whereas Chrissy had all these wonderful skills. And she put in a submission with the Victorian government. It was part of a grant submission for communities like ours. And, you know, she was successful. She got us a lot of money, enough to start a registered charity. And so in October of last year, we were awarded this grant. And then this year, early, we appointed solicitors to help us go through not-for-profit registration, which is huge. We recruited this wonderful brand agency in Sydney to rebrand us. You know, the Sisters for Love is a legacy, it always will be, but we wanted to freshen up our face. We have now a wonderful board. Annie, thank you for joining our MRKH Australia board. And so it was really recognizing all the work that's been done in MRKH sort of advocacy in Australia and awareness, and then taking it to that next level to be sustainable, to be bigger, to have bigger impact and greater reach. Yeah.
So exciting. And as Ali said, yes, I am a board member and I'm so delighted to be so, as I do know someone with MRKH and it is on my heart. And I've just watched with great joy seeing this organization. I always love it when I watch people who've just done the hard yards. They've put out years of service because it's the right thing to do, because it adds value, because they're passionate about it, which is what you had done with Sisters for Love. You know, you'd set this incredible foundation that then realized, you know, oh my goodness, when we partner up and you know what, you've gone and given your colleagues such a big rap, but you've got incredible skills. You know, it's your skills of actually doing all of that networking and high profile relationship building. And, you know, that's it with women in business. You know, it's all of these diverse skills that actually make it all come together, you know. And we often look at other people and go, oh wow, they're really amazing, they've got all these things. And you know, we are all uniquely amazing and special in the skill set that we have, and you have incredibly strong skill set in what you do, in being able to be a champion for this new charity, and to go ahead and apply for this grant and then set yourself up in a really professional manner to know what it requires to, you know, start a charity from scratch, and to be able to get all the documentation and the paper, the paperwork and the policies and the procedures, it's a huge learning curve. And so it's certainly been extra admirable coming on board, onto your board, and to be able to see how you operate. And I'm just been so impressed, and not only impressed with you personally, but also what you stand for, that what you're wanting to give out to people with MRKH. Obviously you're mrkhaustralia.org, by the way, for those who are going to the website, but also in a global sphere. You're in the UK at the moment. You're on in magazines and on interviews, and promoting what MRKH is. And it's so impressive to see someone who actually, it doesn't matter what the condition is, and it doesn't matter what the situation is, it says, well, this is important for me, and if it's important for me, it's important for all the people that I represent, right? And therefore I'll do my very, very best service to be able to provide them for a better outcome, better support, better networks, better services. And I think that's so amazing. It's such an amazing quality that you have.
Thanks, Annie. Please never leave my side.
receive that in great love. No, it's really, I meet a lot of people, and I am really humbled, because it's such a special quality. A lot of people do things for the quick wins, as we know in business, or the quick, gratitude. But I watch people who've done things, for decades or more, and there's just so much in that. So now you've set up this charity, MRKH Australia. And what does that mean? What does it mean in a global perspective? What does it mean? What are you wanting to offer people with MRKH and their families, obviously, all of their supporters, friends, everybody who's connected to someone who has this diagnosis?
Yeah. I think so. I'd say we have four main functions, which is peer support, in terms of advocating for mental health awareness, and some support around that structure. And how do we offer peer support? Is it online? Is it face to face? Is it events? Is it in conferences? So I think that's our first primary goal, is always for the MRKH community, be it in Australia or overseas. We're inclusive in that way. The next, I guess, function for us would be medical stroke research. So we're really proud that we take time to build great relationships with healthcare providers, both in Australia and overseas, because that leads to a number of other avenues. For instance, I have partnered with the University of Queensland with two genetic researchers who are actually looking at the genetic causes behind MRKH. And that relationship allowed us to go to our community and ask for participation in that way. So kind of aiding that research to be better informed about the diagnosis, and also being involved with the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital in Sydney now, who are looking at the uterus transplant trials. So that's a really huge, significant relationship to have. Being part of that surgical team as a patient advocate is also representing the community, being a conduit for our community between healthcare providers and patients. We've discussed, I think, in one of our meetings about, the role around awareness stroke advocacy. And it's a really interesting, and I think we kind of hit the nail on the head about what does advocacy really truly mean. And for me, it means looking at a situation, looking at a cause, and knowing what to do with it, whether you want to enhance its qualities, if we want to remove it, tweak it, or change it. And I think that's the role of the advocate, is to really observe your cause and your why, and how to better improve it for future patient care. And then obviously is to hopefully raise funds and donations to be sustainable, to be able to offer people travel grants to meetings, to or have treatment, say in a hospital where they can't afford to get to maybe Sydney for inpatient treatment, to have resources that are funded and other opportunities. I mean, there really is endless opportunities with that. And then that kind of is all for the purpose of our community and our stakeholders. So the people with MRKH, their parents, their partners, and the healthcare providers. And there's a few more over here to do, maybe with fertility and surrogacy and all the family planning aspects. So I think that was, your question is saying really what is MRKH Australia? And I think it's a wonderful, one of the few not-for-profits in the world that advocates for this condition. As you said, I work very closely with overseas advocates. We've got a great relationship with the charity in America, now doing a lot of work in the UK. And as part of that, we did form in 2016 Global MRKH, which is the first international consortium for, it wasn't to act as a support group per se, but it really is to build in all the world's advocates and doctors and psychologists and researchers and say, what does MRKH look like on your radar? What are you doing of best practice? What are you doing over here? How does that work? Okay, well, what are you doing to grow interest there? And how can we help the underrepresented and the under-marginalized communities? Because I think advocacy, I always say you can call yourself an advocate when you've reached the one person that doesn't know you even exist yet.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you're an advocate. There's people out there that need help that don't even know what MRKH is, and we need to find those people and then look after everybody else that's come through our doors. Yeah.
So tell me, is there a different journey now, 20 years later, if someone was diagnosed, if that 15-year-old girl was diagnosed today, have things improved for them as a pathway to being able to be supported psychologically within their health condition compared to when you went through that experience?
Worlds apart, Annie, worlds apart. First of all, we didn't really have, social media, as much as it can be a bugbear of mine, I think social media has done us so much goodness in the community. I think the formula really for that healing or that peer support pathway comes from connections and comes from empathizing with someone else who's going through the same thing. And because of social media and because of basically patients leading their own advocacy, women for women, has been a huge part of over the last 10 to 12 years. And so when I was diagnosed, there wasn't an online peer support group. There wasn't the resources, and there wasn't the research to understand. We didn't know really that the impact and the adjustment periods and the stages of MRKH through the ages, we didn't know any of that. So we didn't really understand its complications. So it wasn't just the absence of, I guess, an online presence, it was also the absence of knowledge. And the MRKH community are a really great, graceful but fierce bunch of people. And they really do. And I've never come across, I always say I've never come across someone with MRKH that isn't humble and isn't gracious. And so I think we've really looked after our community with kind of like some unspoken terms and conditions. And that just comes down to trust and respect. So for me, yes, it's massive. And I was speaking to a friend of mine the other day, and she was saying that another of her friends who doesn't have MRKH was like, your community just looks so cool. And it's really interesting because if you said that to a person with MRKH, they're like,
they'd be like, what?
We're not cool. We don't want to be here. But it's really interesting because we do have a huge sense of connection, and we are inspiring, and we don't just, it's not lip service when we say we're mentoring, we really support each other. We literally have WhatsApp groups saying, have you, are you speaking to that person? Are they okay? We've got a bit of and then, okay, well, I'll go and speak to them, or they need a referral in India for maybe a peer over here in India, and let's try to match them up. And that's all going on behind the scenes. So it's quite incredible. And I think there's about 21 groups, if you like, around the world now advocating, and some really fierce voices in countries that would be very difficult to advocate and stand up and, use that word, vagina, and use that word infertility. It's punishable in certain countries to have MRKH. So I think we just are changing the narrative around stigma and taboo in women's health, and really trying to do that, I think, honestly, intelligently, and understanding, like, and inviting the skills of others into the community, you know, as you say, with yourself, Annie, with healthcare providers, with people with like-minded passions, but not necessarily have MRKH.
Yeah.
I think that's what we're trying to do now. And as someone who's had MRKH for 22 years, I'm now understanding what it really means to have self-worth and be comfortable in my skin. And that's, it seems very, well, not, I'm sure it's not, but it obviously is quite a simplistic way of me saying that. But my new sort of mantra is, it's not our job or my job to convince you of my self-worth. It's just my job to be kind and compassionate. And I think if we just keep being honest to those sort of deal-breaking edges of uncomfortable slowly, I think that's where we're going to start seeing significant change in women's health. Yeah.
So how can people support you, Ally, if someone wants to? So you're doing all of this voluntarily. You've set up your own organization. You're 100% passionate about it. You've got a tribe of women who help other women doing these support groups. You've been doing it for a decade, and you've got a small grant, really. How do people help support MRKH Australia?
Oh, a plethora of ways. And you mean, of course, you're right. We do it voluntarily. And I think it's also really important to have passion behind anything you do as a volunteer, because that stokes the flame, you know, over years. And so one of the things that we've definitely been speaking about is that we want to be community engaged. So we don't want to be over here doing work for the community without having any insight into what is it you actually want and need from us. We're here to serve you. And so we've been very much getting our community involved in the online peer support groups, which are really amazing opportunities for people to voice how they want to see advocacy moving. Of course, one of our biggest goals is to raise funds. We do have the function as a registered charity now to seek out donors. And I think that can come in the form of small fundraisers to big conscious donor investments. And I think that's something that I'm very much geared towards, because it will give us the ability to not only sustain ourselves from, you know, one year to the next, but also to have opportunities to do some great research projects, get some travel grants, be able to really support our community who are living maybe over in WA or the Northern Territory, and get them to Sydney to sort of understand and participate in what peer support groups look like. We have a really great feature on our website, which is the journal. So I'm a writer. I love words, and words were my freedom. It's how I kind of did a lot of self-discovery without sounding a bit cliche. And there's a lovely opportunity for people to write and contribute for our website. Of course, they'll be mentored and looked after in that process of disclosure potentially. And I would, you know, just spreading the word for us, because whilst we have our networks and we can do a lot of our PR and media and things like that, it only takes one share that someone else who might have MRKH who looks at that to come to us. So we are very new. We are kind of in our infancy, but we have a whole heap of opportunities for our community, both, you know, volunteer and donor, and yeah, just having an opportunity if you are someone with MRKH, that support is waiting for you. Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. So yes, you can help in many ways, but let's face it, I'll do a sell for Ally. If you do have funds, and even if it's a small amount of money, if you can go to mrkhaustralia.org/donation, give a donation to MRKH. As it's a registered charity, it is tax deductible. What you're actually seeing, I'll give you an example of what, you know, some funds could do. So if you're that 15, 16-year-old girl and you're living in a rural, remote area, and you've just been diagnosed with MRKH, and you might be told that you need to now go to Sydney or Melbourne or a metropolitan city to go into a hospital to have, you know, 3 to 5 days of vaginal stretching, for example, which is just a total overwhelming experience, which then also has a financial burden of travel and accommodation. Not only you, hopefully your mom or your sister or someone can come with you. And these are the realities of costs that are involved. And then it's like, well, do I even do it? And what does this all mean? And so forth. So it can be something like that. It can pay for mental health support. It can pay for someone to be able to attend a support group, of which, these people actually, these are women who relate to me. Other people, I don't even feel brave enough to share my story. And these people I don't have to, because they just know. And so it's an area that I'm just so grateful that we are talking about so openly, because it is just one condition. It's one condition that affects women out of the millions of different conditions that help affect different people, but it is such a personal condition that is deeply embedded in people's whole self-value, self-worth, identity, and it's so complex. And I think it's so important to be able to talk about it on this podcast. And so therefore, if you are able to support, I thoroughly encourage you to be able to reach out. And I know that those people on my podcast are asked to donate to your charity, because it is going to add so much value to those that you reach. So let's finish this podcast with what do you see as a successful woman, Ally? What are the qualities of success, and what does that actually even mean to you?
I think a successful woman, for me, is someone who speaks her truth first and foremost, that won't mold to what the expectation she thinks that she should be rather than who she wants to be. I think that's first and foremost, speaking your truth. Persistence, for me, I am quite a persistent person, and I think that being tenacious and being ambitious is what has given me great success. And I also just think it's just having respect for people. So whether you're in the boardroom or whether you're in managing your own restaurant or whether you're in a charity, I just think that at the core of that is connection to people and having great respect for those people. So my answers probably aren't as business, like sort of a business, I guess, persona, if you like, but I've only had my success from deciding not to withhold who I truly am and not apologizing for that and not filtering myself and sort of feeling like I should belong if I do X, Y, and Z. So for me, it's about, there's a humble fierceness. And I think if you can coexist with those two things, you'll be pretty fierce and successful.
100%. Well done for demonstrating that to us today. I think it's just been wonderful chatting with you, and I wish you all the best success for MRKH Australia and the service that you provide to women who need to reach out to you to get the support services that you offer.
Thanks, Annie. Oh, I love this. Thank you so much for everything.
It's a pleasure. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Memoirs of Successful Women. You can find me at anniegibbins.com, where you can download my free resources, get connected on social, and check out my online magic transformation program. If you love this show, feel free to subscribe to future episodes and, of course, share it with your friends. I'll see you again soon, and until then, happy podcasting.